On Wednesday, we will continue our study of Revelation, the third week of that study. And what we've learned, one of the things we've learned so far is that there is a lot of worship in the book of Revelation, and we will read of more worship as we look at chapters 12 through 18. And all this worship reminds me of this definition of liturgy that I found in this commentary on Revelation. It says that liturgy are those practices, rituals, language, and symbols that shape us in particular ways and for particular ends. That definition of liturgy reminded me of something that John Stevens wrote, a minister, a retired minister here at Westminster, in his book, the book he co-wrote with Michael Wachewski, Rhythms of Worship, the Planning and Purpose of Liturgy. And this is what he and Michael write in the sort of the introduction. Worship forms us to live as disciples of Jesus Christ here and now. In worship, God calls us into disciple-forming dialogue, a living and continuing conversation. In worship, we experience God's welcome, grace, and love. In worship, we are addressed, nurtured, equipped, and motivated to be God's people, living our lives as part of God's reign of love for all people and for the whole creation. Worship is not a time of escape from our real lives. It is not a fantasy journey into the long ago and far away. It is always a matter of what is happening now. Wonderful words reminding us that liturgy and worship does shape us. Then I want to read this piece from this book that continues on the same vein, especially in regard to Revelation and the worship and liturgy we find in Revelation. This is on page 90. The empire's religion of temples, statutes, decrees, ordinances, and symbols are, for John, a kind of liturgy that dulls the hearts and the minds of its subjects. We can define liturgy as a practice that is meant to form the worshiping community in a particular way, or as Quaker scholar Ben Pink Dandelion describes it in his book, Liturgies of Quakerism, liturgy is the work of the people. It is something that is done, acted, or performed by the community. Therefore, liturgy can be used for positive or negative formation. It can be used to dull hearts, stunt imaginations, and make people content with the way things are. Worse, it can lead them to believe that the way things are is divinely ordained. Usually it is the people on top who are most likely to believe in this unquestioned divine ordering. John's Revelation is written to a second-generation church struggling with compromise and apathy. The church has plateaued. It's lost its steam and direction. I believe Revelation is a letter meant to spark imaginations, reshape liturgy, and inspire hope. So John, couching these conflicts of the great red dragon and the pregnant woman, images that we will read of this week in Revelation, couching these images within the context of worship tells us something very important. Christian worship is a counter-political act. If the liturgy of the empire is formed by public spectacles of execution, then the liturgy of the Lamb is the exact opposite. Public spectacles of life, caregiving, and transformation. When I say worship is a political act, I don't mean that worship is about politics in the way that we often think about politics today. Worship is not about having a platform to espouse certain ideals. However, worship is not neutral either. What the church does in worship has an impact on how it lives and interacts with the world. I believe that John is arguing the following, that worship is political in that the very act of a group of people gathering together to tell thousand-year-old stories about goodness and evil, peace and war, God and wickedness, is a practice meant to shape hearts, minds, and moral actions. Worship is political inasmuch as proclaiming the Lamb that was slain and is the victor and the one true God over every other idol and power in society is a claim that not only shapes allegiances, but is about survival for those living under oppression. Worship is political because it unveils the illusions of empire. It shows the exploitation and the spectacles of death that it manifests for what they are. Worship is political in that it seeks to build a movement that brings about the kind of world that God intended, heaven on earth, or as we will see in later chapters in Revelation, the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. John's revelation tells us something very important. Christian worship is meant to be a counter-narrative to the liturgy of empire. Think about today's political landscape. The infighting, the victim blaming, the attack ads, the scapegoating. This is the liturgy of empire made manifest before our eyes. It thrives off the build-up to a sacrifice so as to create a public spectacle of execution. Our worship is meant to form us into living in ways that are meant to be public spectacles of life and caregiving. I hope to see you Wednesday.